An 18-year-old girl is sold by her own family in a human market, and the only person willing to buy her is the most notorious and ruthless gunman in the border region. What happens when the man everyone fears is the only one who dares to do the right thing? This is the story of Clara Whitmore, the girl standing at the auction with nothing, and Dane Crow, the man no one in Red Hollow dares to look directly in the eye. Please like and comment the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has progressed. Don't leave, because the best is yet to come. The summer that Clara Whitmore turned 18 was the driest summer Red Hollow had seen in 11 years. The well behind the Whitmore property had dropped so low that a man could climb down and still not touch water. The grass in the eastern pasture had gone the color of old straw. The creek that ran along the property line, the one her father used to fish in on Sunday mornings when he was still alive, had thinned to a muddy trickle that disappeared entirely by the time July rolled around. Even the air tasted like dust, like the land itself was giving up. Clara had noticed the changes long before she understood what they meant. She noticed the way her Uncle Raymond stopped eating supper with her, the way he'd taken to spending evenings at Harlan's saloon, staying until the oil lamps burned low, and then stumbling home smelling like whiskey and something worse, that particular sweetness of a man who'd been making deals he hadn't told anyone about. She noticed the strangers who came to the property in ones and twos, men in town coats who didn't belong in town coats, who walked the fence lines and measured things with their eyes and wrote numbers in small leather books. She noticed how Raymond always met them outside, always spoke in a voice too low to carry, always shook hands in that particular way that meant the conversation was finished before it had started. She asked him about it once. They were in the kitchen, and she was washing the supper dishes, and Raymond was sitting at the table with a glass he kept refilling from a bottle he'd stopped hiding. "Who were those men today?" she said. He didn't look up. "Business." "What kind of business?" "The kind that's not yours." He finally looked at her, just long enough for her to see that his eyes weren't right, too careful, too flat. "Don't ask about things you don't understand, Clara." She didn't ask again, but she started watching closer. Her father, William Whitmore, had died 3 winters ago of a fever that started in his lungs and worked its way through the rest of him over the course of 6 weeks. He'd been a stubborn man, practical and unromantic, who'd built the Whitmore property with his own hands on land that had belonged to his father before him. He hadn't been an easy man to love, but he'd been solid, dependable in the way that things like stone walls and good boots are dependable, not warm, but there when you needed them. He left Clara the property, what remained of the cattle herd, and a mule named Fletcher who was mostly blind in one eye. He also left her Raymond, his younger brother, because he trusted blood over everything and couldn't imagine his daughter managing a frontier property alone at 15 years old. It had seemed, in those first terrible weeks after the funeral, like the right arrangement. It had taken her 3 years to understand what a mistake it was. Raymond Whitmore had never been interested in the land the way William was. He didn't have that particular patience that farming and ranching required, the willingness to do the same hard things day after day and trust that the work would eventually show results. Raymond wanted results fast. He was the kind of man who thought he deserved more than what he had, and that thinking had chased him from one bad investment to the next for most of his adult life. He'd worked in mining camps in Nevada and lost money on a freight operation in Colorado. He'd borrowed from people he shouldn't have borrowed from and ended up owing debts he couldn't talk about in polite company. Clara learned most of this later, after it no longer mattered. What she understood, in those last weeks before everything fell apart, was that Raymond had been using the property as collateral on debt she hadn't known existed. He'd done it carefully, filing paperwork in the county seat while she was occupied with the day-to-day work of keeping the place running. He'd forged her signature where her signature was required. She found this out later from a clerk in the land office who felt bad enough about the whole business to tell her. And by the time she realized what was happening, the property was already gone in every way that mattered legally. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was what Raymond planned to do with her. It was a Tuesday when they came for her. She'd been in the barn, working a bridle that had developed a crack in the cheek piece. The morning was already hot, the kind of thick July heat that made the horses stand still and listless in their stalls, and she was sweating through her work shirt before she'd been at it 20 minutes. She heard the wagon before she saw it. 2 wagons, actually, heavy-wheeled rigs that raised a dust cloud visible from half a mile. Raymond was already outside by the time she got to the barn door. He was standing in the yard with his arms crossed, but he wasn't relaxed. She could see the tension in his shoulders from 30 yards away. He was wearing his good shirt, the one with the bone buttons he only wore when he was trying to impress someone. There were 4 men in the wagons. 3 of them were the kind of men you didn't look at directly if you could help it. Broad through the chest, dressed in work clothes that didn't look like they'd ever seen work, with the flat, watchful eyes of men who got paid to stand between important people and trouble. The 4th man was different. He was older, maybe 50, with a gray beard trimmed close to his jaw and clothes that had clearly been made by someone who charged real money for the privilege. He climbed down from the wagon without hurrying, dusted off his coat, and looked around the property the way a man looks at something he's already decided he owns. His name was Harlan Pruitt. She didn't know that then. "This is the girl?" he said. "That's her," Raymond said. Something moved through Clara's chest. Not quite fear yet, more like the feeling before fear, the animal sense that something has changed in the air. "She looks young," Pruitt said. 18, Raymond said. Pruitt looked at her with an expression that was entirely without warmth. It was an appraising look, the kind you gave livestock. "She'll do." "Wait," Clara said. Her voice came out harder than she expected. "What's happening here? Raymond?" "Get your things," Raymond said. He didn't look at her. "What?" "Your things. Whatever you want to take. You've got 10 minutes. The ground felt strange beneath her feet, like it wasn't quite where she expected it to be. "Raymond, what are you—" "The property's mine now," he said, and something in his voice had gone flat and remote. The way a man's voice goes when he's already made the difficult decision and doesn't want to revisit it. "The debts are paid. This is part of the arrangement." "I'm part of the arrangement," she said. He still wouldn't look at her. One of Pruitt's men stepped forward, not threatening exactly, just establishing distance. Clara looked at the barn, at Fletcher's blind eye watching her from the dark of his stall, at the house where she'd grown up, where her father's books were still stacked on the shelf by the window the way he'd left them, and understood that Raymond had made a decision he couldn't take back. She thought about running. She actually calculated it, the distance to the tree line, the condition of the horses, whether she could get to the nearest neighboring property before Pruitt's men caught her. But she'd grown up practical, and practical people knew when the math didn't work. She went inside and took her mother's sewing kit, a change of clothes, and $15 she'd been saving in a tin box under the floorboard. She left the rest of it. She didn't say goodbye to Raymond. She didn't trust herself to speak to him at all. Red Hollow was not a large town, but it was busy in the way that frontier towns were busy, with the constant traffic of people moving west, people who'd failed at moving west and were now moving back east, traders and freighters and cattle buyers, men who worked the mines in the hills above the valley and came to town on Saturday nights to spend a week's wages in a few hours. There was a main street with the usual assortment: a general store, a saloon, a land office, a doctor's office that doubled as a mortuary, a hotel with 8 rooms that were almost always full. There was a marshal's office at the end of the street, but the marshal, a heavy-set man named Ord, who wore his badge crooked, had a particular talent for being unavailable when the wrong people needed him. The auction house was on the edge of town, in a building that had originally been a warehouse for grain storage. It still smelled like grain, that dusty, dry smell that coated the back of your throat, mixed now with tobacco smoke and sweat, and the particular tension that filled rooms where money changed hands in ways that weren't quite legal. Clara was brought there on the second morning after they took her from the property. She'd spent the night in a room above Pruitt's operation, not mistreated, not touched, just kept, fed a meal she couldn't eat, given a pallet to sleep on that she lay on all night without closing her eyes. By morning, she'd done enough thinking to understand what was coming, and the understanding had settled into her chest like a stone. The auction house was already crowded when they brought her in through the back entrance. She had a moment, just a moment, where the full reality of it hit her. The crowd, the rough plank platform at the front of the room, the men arranged in loose groups around the space, ranchers and merchants, and a few she recognized as traders who came through Red Hollow twice a year with wagon trains. She knew what this was. She'd heard about places like this in the way you heard about things you weren't supposed to know existed. In whispers, in half-conversations that stopped when adults realized children were listening. She knew what it meant that she was here. The fear was extraordinary. It was the kind of fear that moved through your whole body at once and made your hands useless. She breathed through it. Not because she wasn't afraid, she was completely afraid, in a way she hadn't been afraid of anything since the night her father's breathing changed, and she understood he wasn't going to recover. But because she had her mother's stubbornness, which was different from bravery but served the same purpose in a crisis. Her mother had been a woman who didn't cry in front of people. Clara had inherited that. She used it now. She stood straight. She kept her face still. She looked at the room the way she imagined her father would have looked at it, like a problem to be assessed, not a fate to be suffered. The man who ran the auction was named Gideon Fossey. He was a small man, wiry in the way that suggested he'd once worked physical labor but had moved on to something less honest and found the new work more profitable. He had the polished confidence of someone who had done something shameful so many times that he'd stopped feeling shame about it. He wore a brown coat that was too heavy for the heat and kept a pocket watch that he checked with theatrical frequency, as if important things were scheduled, and he was a man who kept to schedules. When they brought Clara onto the platform, Fossey looked at her with professional assessment. "Stand up straight," he said quietly, as if giving helpful advice. "I am standing straight," she said. He looked at her a second longer, then turned to address the room. "Gentlemen," his voice was practiced, carrying without effort to the back of the space. "What we have here is a young woman of good family. The Whitmores, some of you will know the name, in need of a situation. She comes with a clean record and good health, as you can see." Clara kept her eyes forward and her jaw tight. The crowd shifted. There was a particular quality to their attention, not entirely comfortable but not uncomfortable enough to make any of them leave. She recognized this too. The way people watched bad things happen when leaving seemed more complicated than staying. Pruitt was in the front row, positioned like a man who'd already done the math but wanted to see if anyone would make it more interesting. He was watching her with that same flat appraising look he'd used in the farmyard. "We'll start the bidding at $40, Fossey said. Someone in the back called out 50. A man she didn't recognize, stocky with a red beard, raised it to 60. Pruitt said 70 without moving from his position, as if the number cost him nothing. Clara listened to her own heartbeat. It was very loud. The bidding moved slowly at first, then faster as it climbed. 80, 100, 120. She understood, in the way you understand horrible things once you've accepted that they're happening, that the higher number didn't mean safety. It just meant she was worth more to someone. She was trying to keep her breathing even, trying to stay in the practical, hard-edged part of herself that didn't get overwhelmed, when she heard the sound. Everyone heard it. It was the doors. Both of them. The wide double doors that led to the main street, swinging open hard enough to bang against the inside walls. The sound cut through the murmur of the crowd like a pistol shot, and the room went still in a way that rooms only go still when something frightening has entered them. Dane Crow walked through the doors. Clara had heard of Dane Crow the way people in Red Hollow heard about most things that were serious, in pieces, over time, with the particular quality of information that people passed on more carefully than ordinary gossip. She knew he was a gunfighter. She knew he'd killed men. The exact number varied depending on who was telling it, but the lowest number she'd ever heard was 4, and the highest was 14, which probably meant the truth was somewhere nobody was comfortable saying. She knew he'd worked as a range enforcer for the Conley cattle operation over in Millhaven before something happened that nobody would talk about directly, and that he'd been moving more or less without destination since then. She knew that people who knew him said he was quiet and careful, and that the quietness was the dangerous part, not the gun. What she hadn't expected was how ordinary he looked. He was tall. She registered that first, the way he filled the doorframe. Maybe 6'1", lean through the shoulders but not slight, with the kind of build that suggested he worked with his body rather than simply being large. He was maybe 30, maybe a few years older, with the kind of face that weather had worked on long enough to make the age hard to read precisely. Dark hair, a few days of beard, a coat that had seen a lot of miles. His hat was pushed back slightly, and his eyes, when they settled, were a color she couldn't quite determine in the light of the auction house. Gray or green or some combination that changed depending on where the shadows fell. He stood in the open doorway for a moment and looked at the room. Not at her specifically, at the room, taking stock of it with an expression that was almost entirely neutral, the way you looked at a situation you were calculating rather than reacting to. Then his eyes moved to the platform, to Clara. Something in his expression changed. It was subtle. Nothing dramatic, no readable emotion. But something shifted the way a lamp shifts when someone adjusts the wick. She couldn't have said what changed, only that it did. He walked into the room. The crowd parted for him without being asked. She'd heard about this too. The way certain people moved through public spaces and everyone adjusted without quite knowing why. He moved to the side of the room, not to the front where Pruitt was standing, and put his back to the wall with the unconscious habit of a man who didn't like people behind him. Fosse had gone very still. "Mr. Crow," he said carefully, "we weren't expecting that." "I'm not here for conversation," Dane said. His voice was quiet. That was the first thing she noticed about it, the quietness. He didn't project it the way Fosse projected his. He just said things at the volume that was required, and people strained to hear because ignoring him felt like a risk. "What's the current bid?" Fosse blinked. 140. "I'll give you 300. The room absorbed this for a moment. Pruitt turned and looked at Dane for the first time. His expression was careful, measuring. 350, he said. 500, Dane said. There was a sound in the crowd, not quite collective, more like several people drawing breath at the same moment. $500 was several months' wages for a working man in Red Hollow. It was more than most of the ranchers in the room kept in ready cash. "Now hold on," Pruitt said. His voice had changed. The flat control was still there, but something underneath it had tightened. "I don't know what game you're playing, Crow." "Same game you're playing," Dane said. "Only game there is in a room like this. You don't even know why she's here. You don't know what you're buying." "I know what I'm not buying," Dane said. He looked at Pruitt steadily, and something in that look made Pruitt's jaw set hard. "Which is more than you can say, Chapeau." Clara watched this exchange from the platform with the focused attention of someone whose entire future was being decided by other people's words. She was afraid still. The fear hadn't gone anywhere, had just changed shape, become something more watchful and specific. She didn't know Dane Crow except by reputation, and reputation wasn't much to trust your life to. But she was a practical person, and practically speaking, anything was better than Harlan Pruitt. Pruitt looked at Dane for a long moment with the expression of a man who was doing the same calculation she was, running through the angles, checking the exits. He knew Crow's reputation. Everyone in the room knew it. The man standing at the back with the quiet voice had killed people for less than the expression currently on Pruitt's face. 600, Pruitt said. 750, Dane said, without hesitation. The room was very quiet now. Fosse was looking between the two men with visible discomfort, his pocket watch forgotten. Pruitt's eyes moved to the three men he'd positioned around the room. The same men who'd come to the Whitmore property, who'd helped load her into the wagon. He looked at them with a quick calculation that Clara read clearly. She'd grown up watching men calculate odds. What she also read, looking at Pruitt's face, was that Pruitt was running a tighter operation than the bid suggested. He had money, but spending it on a confrontation with Dane Crow in a room full of witnesses was a different kind of cost than the bid itself. There were other variables Pruitt was weighing. His connections in town, his relationships with the men around him, what it would mean if this became a public incident rather than a quiet transaction. He looked at Dane one more time. 750, he said. "You're being a fool, Crow." "Probably," Dane said. "Are you out?" A long silence. "I'm out," Pruitt said quietly. Not defeated exactly, just tabling something. She could see it in his face, the decision to let this one go for now and revisit it in a form of his choosing. That scared her in a different way than the bidding had, because a man who stepped back deliberately was more dangerous than a man who lost. Fosse cleared his throat. $750, he said. "Going once." Wait. It was a man from the far side of the room, a rancher named Kell. She recognized him dimly from previous trips to town, a man who ran a sizable operation 20 miles north of Red Hollow. Wait just a moment. Fosse paused. Kell stepped forward. He was a big man, heavy through the middle with age, with the air of someone who was used to being listened to. I got no problem with Crow outbidding Pruitt, he said, addressing the room as much as Fosse. But I'll note that I have an arrangement with this auction house going back 5 years, and there are certain terms that were agreed to before today's business. He looked at Fosse with something that wasn't quite a threat, but was shaped like one. Terms that don't include outside parties walking in and rewriting the board. Fosse tugged at his collar. Mr. Kell, the bidding was open. The bidding was supposed to stay in this room, Kell said, among people with an understanding of how things work here. He looked at Dane. No offense, Crow. None taken, Dane said pleasantly. How do things work here? Kell looked at him for a moment, deciding how much directness was safe. Certain people, he said carefully, have a stake in how Red Hollow does its business. Certain agreements are in place, arrangements that have taken time to build and that don't benefit from disruption. That's a lot of words, Dane said, for something pretty simple. And what would the simple version be? The simple version is that this room is full of men who've been doing what they're doing for so long they've stopped noticing what it is. Dane looked at Fosse, then at Kell, then let his eyes move around the room with a slowness that had something final in it. I don't have a problem with most of what goes on in Red Hollow. It's not my territory, and it's not my concern, but I put a winning bid on this platform, and I intend to collect on it. And if we disagree, Kell said. Then we disagree, Dane said simply. The silence that followed had weight to it. Claire stood on the platform and looked at the room. At Fosse sweating in his heavy coat, at Kell calculating in the way that large men sometimes miscalculated when they weren't used to meeting resistance, at Pruitt in the front row, who had gone very still with a particular quality of stillness she didn't like, at Dane standing at the back wall with his thumbs hooked in his coat and the quiet that surrounded him like weather. Fosse looked at Kell. Kell said nothing. Fosse looked at Pruitt. Pruitt's expression gave nothing. $750, Fosse said finally, in the voice of a man who had decided that whatever came after today was someone else's problem. Going once. Going twice. She'd expected something to happen. Some intervention, some explosion of the tension that had been building in the room for 20 minutes. Instead, the auction ended with the particular flatness of things that have been decided at a level you can't see directly. Fosse called the final bid. Dane paid in cash. She found out later that he'd had it in a leather satchel inside his coat, prepared, which meant he'd known before he walked in what he was going to do. He counted it out on Fosse's table without ceremony, bills and coins that made Fosse's eyes widen slightly before he recovered his professional composure. Then Dane walked to the platform. He was taller up close. She noticed this in the immediate practical way that you notice things when your survival might depend on the person in front of you. He looked at her for a moment before speaking, and the look was direct without being intrusive. The look of a man who was accustomed to reading situations quickly. My name's Dane Crow, he said. I know who you are, she said. Are you hurt? The question caught her off guard. She'd expected something different. Reassurance, probably, or some explanation of his intentions. The direct practicality of the question was unexpected. No, she said. Good. He nodded once. I'm going to get you out of this room. You don't have to go anywhere after that if you don't want to. She looked at him. In the bad light of the warehouse, with the crowd beginning to move and murmur around them, she tried to read his face for what was underneath it. The angle, the want, the calculation she'd been trained by her uncle's example to expect from men who did things that seemed generous. She couldn't find it. That scared her a little too, in a different way. She was more comfortable with motives she could see. Why did you do this? She asked. He looked at her for a moment. Then, I was in town. I heard about the auction. I've seen a room like this before, and I know how they end. That's not an answer to why. No, he agreed. It's not. He held out his hand, not presumptuous, just offering. Come on, let's get you out of here first. She looked at his hand. She looked at the room around them, where Pruitt was already moving toward the door with his men, where Kell was in quiet conversation with two other ranchers, where Fossey was counting Dane's money and deliberately not looking at anyone. She took his hand. It was rough-palmed and dry, the hand of someone who worked in all weathers. They walked out of the auction house into the white blast of July heat, and behind them the doors swung shut, and for a moment the main street of Red Hollow spread before her, ordinary and indifferent as it always was. The dry dust, the buildings weathered gray, the horses standing sleepy at the hitching posts, the blue sky enormous and uncaring above everything. She was out. She didn't know what out meant yet, or what came next, or whether the man walking beside her was better than what she'd left. She didn't know that Pruitt hadn't given up, only reorganized. She didn't know that Kell's quiet conversation at the back of the auction house was the beginning of something that would make the auction itself seem simple. She didn't know that the records Dane carried in that leather satchel, the ones she hadn't seen yet, the ones he'd spent 3 months collecting, would be what mattered in the end more than any gun or any bid. She knew only what she could see. The dust of the street, the heat, the man walking beside her who moved through the world with the careful quietness of someone who had learned what happened when he wasn't careful, and the $15 in her pocket, which was everything she had left. She held on to that. It was something. It was hers. The rest of it, what she was going to do, where she was going to go, what Red Hollow held for her now that her uncle had stripped everything else away, the rest of it would have to wait for her to breathe first. So she breathed. She put one foot in front of the other in the July dust. And Red Hollow watched her go, the way frontier towns watched everything, without judgment, without mercy, without caring how the story ended. The first thing Dane did after they cleared the auction house doors was nothing. He stood on the boardwalk for a moment, just long enough to scan the street in both directions with the automatic habit of a man who'd been in enough bad situations to know that walking out of one didn't mean you'd left it. Clara stood beside him, squinting in the hard July light, and said nothing either. There was a quality to the silence between them that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't hostile. More like two people who had just done something complicated together and hadn't yet figured out what to say about it. "You have somewhere to go?" he asked. "No," she said. He nodded like this was the answer he'd expected. "There's a boarding house on the north end of the street. Woman named Dottie Marsh runs it. She's decent." He paused. "I'll pay for a week." "I don't need you to—" "I know you don't need me to," he said. "I'm going to anyway." She looked at him with the flat, evaluating expression she'd been using since they left the platform. He seemed to register it without being bothered by it, which she filed away as information. "I want to know what you want from this," she said. "You spent $750 in there. That's not nothing." "No," he agreed. "It's not. So what is it? What does it buy you?" He looked at her for a moment with something that might have been patience and might have been the particular tiredness of a man who is used to having his motives questioned. "It doesn't buy me anything," he said. "That's not how this works." "That is how this works," she said. "That's exactly how it works. You know that better than anyone. You just came out of a room full of men who think everything works that way." "Yeah," he said, "and I'm not one of them." He said it simply, without weight or performance, and something in that simplicity was harder to argue with than a longer explanation would have been. She didn't push it, not because she believed him entirely. She was 18 and she'd just been sold by her own uncle, which had corrected a number of her assumptions about human nature. But because she was standing on a boardwalk in Red Hollow with $15 and the clothes on her back, and some calculations were more immediately important than others. "A week," she said, "and I'll pay you back." "All right," he said. Dottie Marsh was a wide woman in her late 50s who had the look of someone who'd survived things she didn't volunteer information about and had emerged with an efficient sympathy. She felt bad for people quickly and moved on quickly because there were practical matters to attend to. She gave Clara a room on the second floor, clean but small, with a window that looked out over the alley behind the building and a narrow bed with a quilt that had been repaired in 4 different places with 4 different colors of thread. She also gave her a bar of soap, a clean towel, and a look that said she'd seen situations like this before and wasn't going to ask about it. "You're safe here," Dottie said. Just that. Like it was simple information, not reassurance. Clara sat on the edge of the bed after Dottie left and looked at her own hands for a while. They weren't shaking, which surprised her. She'd expected them to shake once she was alone, once there was no longer a reason to hold herself together. Instead, they were just her hands, dry-skinned, calloused along the fingers from years of actual work, not the hands of a girl who'd been protected from the frontier. She let herself feel the fear for a few minutes. She'd been holding it at arm's length all morning, and the effort had cost her, and she owed herself the honesty of it. She'd nearly ended up with Harlan Pruitt, and she knew enough about men like Harlan Pruitt to know that would have been a specific kind of bad that didn't end quickly. She let that reality sit with her until it was real instead of abstract, and then she put it away in the same place she put her father's death and her mother leaving years before that. The shelf where she kept things that were true and terrible and couldn't be changed. Then she washed her face and went downstairs to find Dane Crow. He was in the small front room that Dottie used as a common area, sitting at a table with a cup of coffee and a leather satchel open in front of him, paper spread out in a pattern that looked deliberate. He glanced up when she came in. "Better?" he said. "Some," she said. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat without being invited. "Those papers. What are they?" He looked at her for a moment, then looked at the papers. She had the impression he was making a decision. "Records," he said. "Land transfers. Court filings. Bill of sale documents from the auction house going back 4 years." She looked at them more carefully. They were copies, most of them, made by hand. Someone had spent real time on these. "What are you going to do with them?" "Use them," he said. "Eventually." "Against who?" He picked up one of the documents and looked at it with the expression of a man reading something he'd read many times and hadn't yet finished being angry about. "Fossey runs the auction house. Kell and Pruitt run most of the legitimate property in the territory. The three of them have been working together for about 6 years to push out the smaller landowners, buying cheap from people they've put in financial trouble, running fraudulent title claims through the county recorder, using the auction house to traffic people when the property wasn't enough." He set the paper down. "There are about 40 families in this territory who've lost land they were owed. Some of them just lost property. Some of them lost more than that." Clara looked at the papers with a different attention now. She picked up the one closest to her, a transfer document dated 3 years ago, with a name in the seller's line that made her stomach do something strange. "William Whitmore," she said. "Yeah," Dane said. She set it down carefully. "This is my father's land." "It was your father's land," he said, "before it was transferred to a holding company that doesn't exist outside a filing cabinet in the county recorder's office." He paused. "The transfer was dated 8 months before your father died." She heard what he was saying. It took her a moment to fully hear it because the implication was large. "He didn't sign this." "No," Dane said. "Someone forged his signature." Raymond Whitmore was the witness on the document. She sat with that for a moment. The thing about her uncle, the thing she'd been trying not to know for 3 years, the thing that explained everything she'd watched and filed away without wanting to understand, settled into place with a finality that felt like something physical. Not shock exactly, more like the particular weight of being right about something terrible. "He's been working with them," she said. "Since before your father got sick," Dane said. "As far as I can tell." She looked at the papers again. All that careful handwork, all those copies. "How long have you been collecting these?" "About 3 months." "Why?" He picked up his coffee. The cup was nearly empty. "I knew a man named Theodore Sears," he said. "Had a homestead about 30 miles east of here. Good land, decent water access. He'd worked it for 12 years. He looked at the cup. Kell ran a fraudulent title claim on it about 18 months ago. Sears contested it. The contest went nowhere because the county recorder was in Kell's pocket." He set the cup down. "Sears had a wife and 4 daughters. The morning after the court ruled against him, he rode out to the land Kell had taken, and they found him there 2 days later." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Clara looked at him. The tiredness in his face was an old tiredness, she realized. Not the tiredness of a man who hadn't slept, but the tiredness of someone carrying something that had been heavy for a long time. "You knew him," she said. "He was my father's age," Dane said. "He'd been kind to me when there wasn't any reason to be." He paused. Men like Kell and Pruitt, they don't think much about the people they go through to get what they want. That's the thing about them. It's not that they're cruel exactly, it's that the people are just inconvenient, just obstacles. Something hardened in his face, very briefly, and then went neutral again. I've been in the business of being an obstacle my whole life. I figured I might as well do it intentionally. What she came to understand over the next several days was that Dane Crow was a more complicated thing than his reputation suggested. The reputation said, dangerous, solitary, useful for violence. The reputation said he'd killed men in gunfights, which was true, and that he enjoyed it, which was not. The reputation said he was cold, which was partly true in the way that still water was cold. It looked still, but things moved in it if you watched long enough. He was also methodical in a way that surprised her. He'd spent 3 months building a case that a lawyer could present. Not just the records, but a chain of evidence connecting each document to the next. Affidavits from people willing to testify about what they'd witnessed. A letter from a federal land commissioner in the territorial capital who had reason to be interested in what was happening in Red Hollow. He'd done this quietly, patiently, without telling anyone in town what he was building. If you'd gone to the marshal, Clara said on the third day, sitting at Dottie's table while Dane reorganized his papers for what seemed like the 7th time. Ord, he said, not looking up. Yes. Ord's on Kell's payroll, he said. Has been for 4 years. I have a document on that, too. She watched him work. And the federal commissioner? He's coming, Dane said. 3 weeks, maybe 4. He'll have the authority to convene an inquiry and arrest the county recorder. He paused. The problem is 3 weeks. She understood the problem. Pruitt won't wait 3 weeks. No. He looked up at her. He let it go at the auction because a public scene with witnesses wasn't useful to him. But he knows I have something. He's known since before the auction that I've been asking questions and talking to people. He just doesn't know how much. He spread his hands over the papers. 3 weeks is a long time to hold position in a town where the marshal doesn't work for you. What do you need? He looked at her. I need the people Kell and Pruitt have been pushing around for 6 years to understand what's happening and be willing to stand up at the right moment. He paused. Which is the part I'm not good at. What do you mean? I mean, I can collect evidence and I can handle a confrontation, he said, with the directness of someone who'd assessed himself accurately and without vanity. But I'm not the person who makes people trust me in a room. I walk into a room and people get quiet and careful. That's useful sometimes. It's not useful when you need people to feel like they can speak honestly. She thought about this. She thought about the farmyard and her uncle and the men who'd come to measure the fence lines, and the way she'd spent 3 years watching things she wasn't supposed to understand, building a quiet, comprehensive picture of what was happening around her. Who've you talked to so far, she said. He named 4 people, 2 former ranch hands who'd been let go from operations Kell had absorbed, a woman who'd lost a homestead claim 2 years ago, an older man who ran a small freight operation and had seen enough traffic in and out of Pruitt's properties to know what they were moving. I need to talk to them, Clara said. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Why? Because they don't know me, she said. They know you, and knowing you makes them nervous even if they want to help. She held his gaze. I'm not threatening. I'm 18 and I don't have a gun and I just stood on Fosse's platform. People will talk to me. A long moment. That's probably true, he said. It's definitely true, she said. She was right, and she'd known she was right, but the knowing didn't make the conversations easy. The woman who'd lost the homestead was named Vera Aldis, 43, still living in Red Hollow because she didn't have money to go elsewhere, working as a laundress for 3 of the town's businesses. Clara found her behind the hotel on a Tuesday morning, working through a pile of sheets in a wooden tub with the mechanical focus of someone who'd learned to keep her head down and her hands moving. Vera looked at Clara when she approached with the flat expression of a woman who'd been disappointed by enough people to make hope expensive. Dane Crow sent you, she said. He didn't send me, Clara said. He told me your name. I came on my own. Vera worked the sheet through the water. What do you want? I want to know what happened to your land, Clara said. And I want to know if you're willing to say it to a federal investigator in about 3 weeks when one arrives in Red Hollow. Vera was quiet for a long moment, working. And if I am willing, what does that change? It changes who the county recorder goes to prison for, Clara said, and it changes whether Kell's title on your land holds or gets voided. Vera stopped working. She looked at Clara with the direct, measuring look of a woman who had learned to identify the difference between people who meant what they said and people who thought they did. You're the Whitmore girl, she said. Raymond Whitmore's niece. Yes, Clara said. Your uncle sold you. Yes. Vera looked at her for another long moment. Then she wrung out the sheet with both hands, efficient, practiced, and draped it over the line. Tell me about this federal investigator, she said. She talked to 7 people in 4 days. Not all of them said yes. 2 of them were too frightened, and she didn't push. Fear was a rational response to the situation, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But 5 of them said yes, including Vera, and each yes came with something else. Names of other people who'd been affected, details she hadn't known, pieces of the picture that filled in gaps in Dane's collection of documents. She brought it all back to him in the evenings, sitting at Dottie's table, and he listened with the focused attention of someone who knew how to identify which information mattered and which was noise. On the 4th evening, as she was laying out what she'd learned from a former ranch hand named Gus Pettit about the movement of goods through Pruitt's warehouse operation, Dane looked up from the notes he was making and said, "You're good at this." She looked at him. At what? Getting people to talk to you. They're not talking to me because I'm good at it, she said. They're talking to me because I'm one of them. I lost something too. She paused. It's different. He considered this. Fair enough, he said. She went back to Gus Pettit's information, but she was aware, in the way that you become aware of things that shift gradually, that something had changed slightly in the room. Not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to. Just the small adjustment of 2 people who had started to understand that what they were doing together was more than what either of them had started it as. Outside, Red Hollow went about its business under the July heat, and Harlan Pruitt's wagons moved through the streets, and Kell's men rode in and out of the properties north of town, and Foss's auction house sat quiet on the edge of Main Street, waiting for the next transaction. And in the front room of Dottie Marsh's boarding house, the evidence kept building, paper by paper, name by name, the slow, patient weight of it accumulating towards something that the town's most powerful men had no idea was coming. The trouble started on a Wednesday, which was the kind of detail that didn't matter and that Clara would remember anyway for the rest of her life. She'd been at the general store, talking to a man named Arlo Beck, who ran a small cattle operation on the western edge of the valley and who'd had a grazing rights dispute with Kell's people the previous spring. Arlo was cautious, Tom. The kind of cautious that came from watching what happened to people who weren't. And the conversation had taken most of the morning to get anywhere useful. But by the time she left, she had his name in the list of people willing to speak to the federal investigator, and she had something else too. A detail about a specific transaction that Kell had run through the county recorder's office using a third party that didn't appear in any of Dane's documents. She was walking back toward Dottie's when she noticed the men. There were 3 of them, positioned along the main street in the particular way that men positioned themselves when they were watching something and trying not to look like they were watching it. She recognized 2 of them from Pruitt's operation, the broad-shouldered one who'd been at the farmyard the morning they took her, and a younger man with a narrow face she'd seen outside the auction house. The third was someone she didn't know, older, with a rifle slung across his back that he wore too casually. She didn't change her pace. She walked straight to Dottie's and went in through the front door without looking back. Dane was at the table. He looked up when she came in, and something in her face told him what he needed to know before she said a word. How many? He said. 3 on the street, she said. Possibly more I didn't see. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and went to the window, standing to the side of it, not visible from the street, and looked out at an angle. Pruitt's, he said. 2 of them are. The third I don't know. He came back to the table. His face had the particular stillness that she'd come to recognize as him thinking hard about something he didn't like the options on. He's been patient for 9 days, Dane said. That's longer than I expected. What changed? Something changed on his end, Dane said. Either he found out about the commissioner or someone told him I've been talking to people. He looked at the papers on the table, the organized, careful architecture of 3 months' work. Either way, he's not going to keep watching. She sat down. How long do we have? Before he moves directly? He thought about it. Tonight, maybe. Tomorrow morning at the outside. She processed this against the facts available to her. The federal commissioner was still 2 weeks away, minimum. 5 people had agreed to speak, but agreement given in private wasn't the same as testimony in front of an official proceeding. The documents were solid, but only useful if someone with authority actually received them. None of this was complete enough to survive a direct move by Pruitt. Not legally, not physically. What would he do? She said. Directly. Take the papers, Dane said. Remove the people who might talk. He said it plainly, without dressing it up. Start with me, probably. Then work through the list. Then we can't wait, she said. No. He looked at her. We can't. She thought about Vera Aldis wringing out sheets behind the hotel, and Arlo Beck's careful face in the general store, and Gus Pettit, who'd already lost one job for knowing too much. She thought about the list of names in Dane's records, 40 families, the people behind each document, the specific human weight of each forged signature and fraudulent title. We need to move the papers somewhere safe, she said, and we need to do it tonight. The papers, yes, Dane said, but that's not enough. Pruitt knows I have them. Even if he can't get to them, he can discredit them. Tell the commissioner they were fabricated, that I have a personal grievance. He has the county recorder, the marshal, the established reputation in this territory. He paused. What I need is witnesses, not people who'll testify in 3 weeks, people who'll stand up tomorrow in public and say what they know. Clara looked at him. That's a lot to ask of frightened people, she said. Yes, he said. It is. What? She went to Vera first because Vera was the one she trusted most to give an honest answer, rather than the answer she thought Clara wanted to hear. It was nearly dark by then, the air finally cooling from the day's heat, the sky going that deep bruised blue over the western ridgeline that Clara had always found beautiful in spite of herself. She found Vera at her rooms above the laundry. A single small space that smelled like lye soap and damp wood, tidy in the way that very small spaces had to be tidy to remain livable. Vera listened to what Clara told her without interrupting. She was sitting on the edge of her bed and she looked at the floor while she listened, her hands folded in her lap with the patient stillness of someone who'd had practice receiving bad news. When Clara finished, Vera was quiet for a long moment. Tomorrow, she said. Yes. In public. Yes. Vera looked up. What happens if it doesn't work? If Pruitt has enough people in the right places that it doesn't matter what we say? Clara had thought about this on the walk over. She'd wanted to have a better answer than the one she had. Then it's worse for a while, she said. And then the commissioner arrives and it matters again. But the people who stood up will have stood up, and Pruitt will know that his operation isn't invisible anymore. That's not a very comforting answer. No, Clara said. It's not. Vera looked at her for a long time. Clara didn't fill the silence with reassurance she didn't have. All right, Vera said finally. Where and when? What they managed to assemble, working through the evening in separate directions and meeting back at Dottie's at midnight, was not exactly what Dane had hoped for, and not as little as Clara had feared. 7 people confirmed: Vera, Gus Pettit, Arlo Beck, 2 of the former ranch hands, the older man who ran the freight operation, and a woman named May Sutter who'd lost her son's homestead claim to a fraudulent transfer and had been waiting for 2 years for a moment exactly like this one without quite believing it would come. They gathered at Dottie's in the small hours, crowded into the common room with the lamps turned low. Dottie herself moved through the group with coffee she didn't charge for, which was her version of a declaration of support. Dane stood at the front of the room and laid out what was going to happen the next morning with the same methodical clarity he brought to everything. Who would be where, what would be said, how the documents would be presented, and to whom. He was not a man who gave speeches. What he gave was information, specific and organized, and the people in the room listened with the concentrated attention of those who understood that the details mattered. Arlo Beck asked the question everyone was thinking. What about Ord? Ord's going to be a problem, Dane said. He'll try to shut it down as a public disturbance. We need to move fast enough that by the time he decides to act, there are too many witnesses for it to be clean. And Pruitt's men? That was Gus, who had the practical concern of someone who'd been in physical danger before. Dane looked at him steadily. They'll be there. I expect it gets loud. He paused. I'm not going to promise you it doesn't. Nobody left. Clara noticed this. The moment when people could have reasonably decided the cost was too high, and nobody moved for the door. The morning came the way bad mornings did. Too fast and too bright. The sun already hard at 7 o'clock. The dust on the main street catching the light in a way that made everything look stark and too defined. They'd chosen the auction house itself. This was Clara's suggestion, and she'd made it partly for practical reasons. It was the largest public space in Red Hollow, centrally located, impossible to miss, and partly for reasons she didn't explain to anyone, which had to do with the particular satisfaction of walking back into a place that had nearly consumed her and using it for something different. Fosse was already inside when they arrived, which meant someone had told him to expect them. He was standing by his auctioneer's platform with two men she didn't recognize and the expression of someone who'd been caught between forces he didn't fully control. He looked at Dane, then at Clara, then at the 7 people filing in behind them. This is a private business, he said. His voice had lost some of its practiced smoothness. This is a public gathering on the matter of land fraud and trafficking operating out of this building, Dane said. He set the leather satchel on Fosse's table and opened it. You can stay or you can leave, but either way, this is happening. Fosse looked at the satchel. He looked at the papers beginning to come out of it. Something crossed his face that was complicated and not easy to categorize. A man recognizing that he'd made choices that were about to become visible to people who could hold him accountable for them. Word spread the way it did in small frontier towns, which was fast and imprecise and unstoppable. People began coming in from the street, a few at first, then more, drawn by the combination of Dane Crow's name and the gathering of familiar faces and the particular atmosphere that settled over a place where something important was being decided. By the time Dane began speaking, there were close to 40 people in the room. He didn't make a speech about justice or corruption. He laid out facts. Transfer document by transfer document, he walked through the chain of fraud, the forged signatures, the shell companies moving through the county recorder's office, the auction records connecting human trafficking operations to the same network of names. He named Kell, he named Pruitt, he named Fosse, and where each name appeared, he placed a document on the table in front of him with the date and the specifics. It was not dramatic in any conventional sense. It was detailed and specific and relentless, and that was its own kind of drama. Clara stood to his right and watched the room. She saw the moment Kell arrived. He came in through the main doors with 4 men and stopped when he saw the crowd. His face went through several things quickly: surprise, calculation, anger arriving at anger. He was a man who was used to entering rooms and having them rearrange themselves around him, and this room was not doing that. "Crow," Kell said, loud enough to cut across the speaking. "Whatever you think you're doing, I'm presenting documentary evidence of land fraud to the residents of Red Hollow," Dane said, without raising his voice, "in advance of a federal inquiry that will be convened here in approximately 2 weeks. He looked at Kell steadily. "You're welcome to listen." "Those documents are fabricated," Kell said. "They came from the county recorder's office," Dane said. "The recorder's signature is on 12 of them. His office seal is on all 12. He picked one up and held it so the room could see. If they're fabricated, they were fabricated by your own people." Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically. It was more like the collective mood adjusted, the way a scale adjusts when weight is added to one side. Clara saw it in faces. The people who'd come in curious and skeptical, beginning to follow the logic of what was laid out in front of them. Pruitt came in through the side door. He came in quietly, without the entry Kell had made, which meant he'd been watching from outside and had timed his arrival deliberately. He had 3 men with him, positioned at different points around the room in a way that Clara read immediately as a tactic, spreading the threat so it couldn't be addressed from any one direction. Pruitt looked at the room, looked at the table covered in documents, looked at Clara. His face was perfectly controlled and gave away nothing except that he was doing the same calculations she was. "This is impressive," he said. Not to Dane specifically, to the room. He had a public voice, smooth and credible. The voice of a man who'd been convincing people of things for a long time. "Mr. Crow has put real work into this presentation. Some of these documents may even be real." He let this settle. "But I want you all to think about who's presenting them. A man with a violent history, with no property or standing in this community, who showed up unannounced 9 days ago and has been privately meeting with people who have personal grievances against the most successful landowners in this territory." He spread his hands. "He's asking you to trust him. I'm asking you to think about why." It was effective. Clara saw it land on some faces in the room. The reasonable doubt that Pruitt was manufacturing. The way a confident voice could make clear things uncertain. Gus Pettit stepped forward. He was not a naturally forward person. She'd understood this from the first conversation, the way he'd measured his words and kept his body turned slightly toward the door. But he stepped forward, and he said in a voice that wasn't quite steady, "My name is Gus Pettit. I worked the Hendricks operation for 4 years before Kell's people took it over. I was there when they moved the transfer papers. I saw who signed them, and I saw who was in the room." He looked at Kell. That man was in the room. The silence that followed was complete. Then Vera Aldis said, "My name is Vera Aldis. 3 years ago, I filed a valid homestead claim on land in the eastern section of this valley. 4 months later, the county recorder issued a competing title based on a transfer document I never signed." She paused. "I have the original filing." One by one, the 7 of them said their names and said what they knew. It was not the federal proceeding. It was not legally binding testimony. But it was specific and it was public. And it was 7 real people standing in the room where their lives had been disrupted by the men they were describing. And the difference between Dane's evidence and Pruitt's smooth rebuttal was that Dane's evidence had human faces standing next to it. Pruitt's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Clara was close enough to watch his eyes move, to the documents, to the witnesses, to his men positioned around the room, running the calculation. Kell was less controlled. "This is slander," he said loudly. "Every one of you will be answering to my lawyers." "Your lawyers are going to be busy," Dane said. He reached into the satchel and produced a document that was different from the others. Heavier paper, an official seal. "This is a letter from Commissioner Aldrich Harmon of the Federal Territorial Land Office, dated 3 weeks ago, authorizing an inquiry into land transfer irregularities in Red Hollow County." He set it on the table. "He'll be here in 2 weeks. These documents will be submitted as preliminary evidence. The witnesses in this room will be asked to provide formal statements." The letter was real. Everything else could be questioned, but that letter carried an authority that the room felt immediately, the weight of something that came from outside Red Hollow, from beyond the reach of Kell's local connections and Ord's comfortable corruption. Kell looked at Pruitt. Pruitt looked at the letter. The man with the rifle on his back, the one Clara hadn't recognized, shifted his weight, and Dane's hand moved to his side with a reflex that was faster than thought. "Don't," Dane said quietly. Just the one word. The man went still. What happened next was not clean. Nothing that happened in that room was clean. Fossey, who'd been standing near his platform throughout with the look of a man watching his own house burn, began talking, quickly, to no one in particular, about cooperative arrangements and good faith and the desire to clarify certain misunderstandings with the federal authorities. His men looked at him and then looked at each other with the expressions of people reconsidering their employment. Kell stepped toward the table, and 3 people stepped between him and it simultaneously. Gus, Arlo Beck, and May Sutter, who was 60 years old and looked at Kell with an expression that had nothing afraid in it. "Move," Kell said. "No," May said. Pruitt's men began converging from their positions around the room, and the crowd that had assembled shifted and tightened, and for a few seconds the auction house was very loud and very confused. People shouting, someone going down, the crash of the table moving. Clara grabbed the satchel, not heroically, not gracefully, stumbling sideways with her shoulder against the table's edge, and the leather handle slipping before she got it, and got to the wall behind Dane. He'd put himself between her and Pruitt's closest man without appearing to decide to do it, which was the kind of thing she noticed even in the middle of everything else happening. The confrontation lasted about 4 minutes by Clara's estimate, which felt like considerably longer. No guns were fired. There were 2 men on the floor before the crowd's combined weight made forward movement by Pruitt's people impractical, and it was the crowd, the 40 ordinary people who'd come in from the street and stayed and listened, that did it, simply by not moving when Pruitt's men needed them to. Small acts of not moving. That was what it came down to. When the marshal finally arrived, Ord, red-faced and late, having taken his time about getting there, the room was already settled into a specific configuration. Pruitt's men were against the far wall, contained less by force than by the weight of public witness. The documents were on the table, undisturbed. 7 people with names and specific knowledge were standing in a room with 40 witnesses. Ord looked at all of it. He looked at Dane, who looked back at him without expression. He looked at Kell, who gave him a look that was an instruction. He looked at the letter from Commissioner Harmon, which Dane had positioned at the front of the table where it was impossible to miss. Ord put his thumbs in his belt and said nothing for a long time. Claire could see him working through the math, whose side was safe to be on, what this looked like, what came after. It was not a flattering calculation to watch a man make, but she watched him make it, and she watched the moment when the weight of the commissioner's letter and 40 witnesses tipped the balance in a direction Kell hadn't planned for. "Everyone settle down," Ord said finally. To the room in general, committing to nothing. It was not a victory, but it was not a defeat either, and in the auction house in Red Hollow, on that bright July morning, not a defeat was the best available outcome. Clara stood with her back to the wall and the satchel in both hands and breathed through it. The papers were safe. The witnesses were still standing. The letter was on the table. 2 weeks, she thought. They had to survive 2 weeks. The 2 weeks that followed were the strangest of Clara's life, which was saying something given the week that had preceded them. Red Hollow didn't explode after the confrontation in the auction house. That was what she'd half expected. Some immediate rupture, violence spilling into the streets, Pruitt's men making moves that forced things to a head before the commissioner arrived. Instead, the town went quiet, in the particular way that places went quiet when everyone was waiting to see which way something landed. People still bought flour at the general store and drank at Harlan's saloon and moved their cattle through the valley roads. But there was a watchfulness to it, a held-breath quality that Clara felt every time she walked the main street. Pruitt had pulled back. This worried her more than aggression would have. "He's regrouping," Dane said, on the 4th day after the auction house confrontation. They were at Dottie's, where they'd been spending most evenings. The papers reorganized again into a presentation order that would make sense to a federal investigator. "He knows what's coming. He's trying to get ahead of it." "How?" "3 ways he can go," Dane said. He developed the habit of thinking out loud with her. She noticed this, the gradual shift from him processing things privately to working through them in conversation. First, he tries to discredit the evidence before Harmon arrives. Gets to Fossey, convinces him to recant, creates an alternative account of what the documents mean. Can Fossey do that? "Fossey is scared enough to do anything," Dane said, but Fossey is also smart enough to know that cutting a deal with Pruitt doesn't protect him from the federal inquiry. It just makes him more implicated. He paused. Second option, he runs. Takes what he can liquidate quickly and leaves the territory before Harmon gets here. And the third? Dane was quiet for a moment. He tries to remove the evidence and the witnesses, permanently. She let this sit for a second. Which do you think he'll choose? Probably a combination of the first and working up to the third if the first doesn't work, he said. He looked at her with the directness she'd gotten used to. Which means we need to be careful, not just you and me, the witnesses. She'd already been thinking about this. She'd been checking in on Vera and Gus and the others every day since the confrontation, finding small reasons to pass by their locations, making sure they were still present and still steady. The steadiness was the thing she worried about most. Not that Pruitt would move openly against them, but that he'd find the right pressure point for each person and apply it quietly until they changed their minds about testifying. May Sutter was the first one to show her what that pressure looked like. May came to Dottie's on the 6th day, in the late afternoon, with the expression of someone who'd made a decision they weren't proud of. She was a tall woman, angular and dry-voiced, who'd impressed Clara from the start with her lack of sentimentality about the situation. She sat down at the table without being asked and put her hands flat on the surface. "Someone burned my fence line last night," she said. "East pasture, 40 yards of it." Clara looked at her. "Were you hurt?" "No, nobody was." May's jaw was tight, but the message is clear enough. "You're still going to testify," Claire said. It wasn't a question exactly. May looked at her for a long moment. "I didn't say I wasn't. I said someone burned my fence." She paused. "I'm telling you because you need to know what they're doing, not because I'm asking your permission to change my mind." Clara felt something shift in her chest. The particular relief of finding that someone was tougher than the situation required. "All right. What do you need?" "Nothing from you," May said. "I can fix the fence. I just wanted you to know." After May left, Clara went to find Dane, who was talking to Gus Pettit near the freight office at the end of the street. She told him about the fence. "That's Pruitt," Dane said without surprise. "I know it's Pruitt. What do we do about it?" He thought for a moment. "I'll talk to some of Kell's former ranch hands, the ones Kell pushed out when he absorbed the Hendricks operation. They've got reason to be unhappy, and they're not part of our witness group, which means Pruitt hasn't been watching them." He paused. "If people are moving through the area at night, having more people watching the outlying properties changes the calculation." It wasn't a perfect solution. It was barely a solution at all, more like a response that made the problem slightly less bad. But that was the character of the 2 weeks. A series of responses that made things slightly less bad, accumulating towards something that might be enough. On the 9th day, Fossey disappeared. Not violently. He simply wasn't at the auction house in the morning, and his rooms above the building had been cleared out. The personal items gone with a thoroughness that suggested planning rather than panic. He'd taken certain ledgers with him, which Dane had anticipated, and copied the critical pages from weeks earlier. He'd left behind the building itself and a number of documents he apparently hadn't known were relevant, which were exactly the documents Dane had been hoping he'd leave. "He ran," Gus said when they told him. "He ran," Dane confirmed. "Does that hurt us?" "It helps us," Clara said before Dane could answer. "Fossey running makes him look guilty. Anyone who was thinking about backing his version of events now has to weigh what it means that he's gone." She looked at Dane. "Pruitt loses his most credible alternative narrative." Dane looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as him deciding he agreed with something he hadn't quite finished thinking through himself. "Yes," he said. But Fossey's departure also meant something else, which neither of them said directly for a while. Pruitt was now operating without a buffer. Fossey had been the public face of the auction operation, the man who technically ran the transactions. With Fossey gone, the connection between Pruitt and what had happened in that building was more direct than before. That made the evidence stronger. It also made Pruitt more dangerous, because a man with less to lose through exposure moved differently than one who was still protecting something. On the 11th day, Kell made his move. It came through a lawyer, a man named Garrett, who rode into Red Hollow from the county seat with papers filed under an obscure territorial provision that allowed a creditor to claim first rights on contested assets pending an official inquiry. The papers named Dane Crow specifically as a party in a civil dispute and requested that he be held available for proceedings, which in practical terms meant that Ord could detain him legally if he chose to. It was clever. Clara could see the cleverness of it, even as she felt the anger of it. A legal instrument used like a weapon, wielding the appearance of process against the substance of what they were building. Ord came to Dottie's that afternoon with the papers and the expression of a man who was not entirely comfortable with what he'd been asked to do, but had decided his discomfort wasn't sufficient reason to refuse. "Mr. Crow," he said, standing in the doorway of the common room, "I got a civil filing here with your name on it." Dane looked at the papers Ord held out. He took them and read them with the deliberate care of a man who wasn't going to react before he understood exactly what he was reacting to. "This is Kell's doing," Dane said. "I just serve what I'm given," Ord said, which was the least convincing thing Clara had ever heard come out of a human mouth. "Does this require me to stay in Red Hollow?" "Requires you to be available for proceedings," Ord said, "which, as long as those proceedings are pending, means I can't leave town," Dane said flatly. He looked at Ord. which is what Kell wants. Ord said nothing. He's trying to cut me off from Commissioner Harmon, Dane said. If I can't ride out to meet the commissioner's party and escort them in, Kell has time to arrange a different reception. Claire had been standing near the door. She looked at Dane, then at the papers in his hands, then at Ord's carefully neutral face. The filing requires Dane to be available, she said. It doesn't say anything about anyone else. Ord looked at her. I can ride out, she said. I'm not named in any filing. Dane looked at her with an expression that had several things in it at once. The one on top was something like concern. Underneath that was the recognition that she was right. You'd be riding alone, he said. I know that. Pruitt's people are still watching the roads. I know that too. Clara. How far is the commissioner's party? She asked Ord, because Ord was the one who'd know the official route and timing. Ord shifted his weight. He was a man who'd made a series of small compromises over a long period that had carried him to a position he hadn't quite meant to occupy, and the process of being in that position was visibly uncomfortable in this moment. Party left the territorial capital 12 days ago, he said slowly. If they're keeping schedule, they're maybe 40 miles east, probably camped in the Ridgeline Flats area. That's a day's ride, Claire said. Day and a half if you're pushing it safe, Ord said. She looked at Dane. Which horse can I take? He was quiet for a moment. Not deciding whether she should go, she could see that he'd already decided she was right, that it was the only play available. He was deciding how to manage his own response to it, the part of him that wanted to find a different solution so that she didn't have to be the one riding 40 miles into uncertain country alone. Marsh has a gray mare in the back stable, he said finally. She's sound and she knows the eastern roads. He paused. You leave at 3 in the morning, before Pruitt's people are positioned. All right, she said, and you take Gus's rifle. Don't argue about it. She didn't argue. The ride east was the loneliest thing she'd done since she was 15 years old and sat by her father's bedside in the last days of his fever and understood that she was going to be alone in the world when it was over. The dark before dawn was absolute out beyond the town lights, the stars enormous overhead, the gray mare's hooves quiet on the dry ground. Clara rode with the rifle across her saddle and the particular focused attention that solitary travel through open country required, watching the shapes at the edge of visibility, listening for sounds that didn't belong to the night, staying present and deliberate against the pull of her own thoughts. She found Commissioner Harmon's party in the late afternoon of the second day, camped in the scrubland east of the Ridgeline Flats exactly where Ord had estimated. There were 6 of them, Harmon himself, 2 deputies, a clerk, and 2 territorial marshals who outranked Ord in every legal sense that mattered. Harmon was a compact, precise man in his mid-50s who listened to Claire's account of Red Hollow with the attention of someone who was paid to separate relevant information from noise and was good at his job. He asked questions. Good questions, specific ones, the kind that told her he'd dealt with situations like this before and understood what the pressure points were. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You rode 40 miles alone to find us, he said. Dane Crow has a civil detainment on him, she said. Someone had to. He looked at her with the assessing expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of a situation. How old are you? 18, she said. He nodded once. We'll move out at first light tomorrow, he said. We'll make Red Hollow by nightfall. The final day was the hardest to explain because it didn't happen in one place or one moment. It happened across the whole town simultaneously, in overlapping pieces that Clara only understood completely when she was able to put them together afterward. She rode back into Red Hollow with Harmon's party as the sun was going down, the town going amber and long-shadowed in the late light. Dane was waiting at the edge of the main street, which meant Gus had been watching for them, which meant the entire network of people they'd built over 2 weeks had been on alert all day. He looked at her as she rode in, and the look was the particular look of someone who'd spent a day trying not to calculate the odds and failing at it. You're back, he said. I said I would be, she said. Commissioner Harmon and his party moved through Red Hollow with the authority that federal marshals carried simply by being federal marshals in a territorial town. An authority that had nothing to do with guns and everything to do with the weight of institutional backing that local operations like Kells and Pruitt's could manipulate but couldn't ultimately override. Ord received Harmon's credentials in the marshal's office, with the expression of a man at the end of a long, difficult road he'd walked himself into. The civil filing against Dane was voided within an hour, on Harmon's authority, pending the inquiry proceedings. Kell's lawyer, Garrett, attempted to present a competing account of the evidence, a prepared document that offered an alternative explanation for the land transfers, framing them as legitimate transactions that had been misrepresented by parties with personal grievances. Harmon read it carefully, asked 3 questions, and set it aside. What happened to Kell's operation then was not dramatic, it was methodical. Harmon's deputies, accompanied by the territorial marshals, visited the properties, executed search warrants, and collected the physical records from the county recorder's office, records that, when laid alongside Dane's copies, demonstrated the fraud in terms that required no interpretation. The county recorder himself, a man named Pitts, who'd been in that office for 8 years and had apparently spent most of those years making decisions he'd hoped would never see daylight, cooperated within 2 hours of the marshals arriving at his door. Cooperation was the word Harmon's clerk used, writing it into the official report. What it meant in practice was that Pitts gave them everything: names, dates, the specific mechanisms by which titles had been falsified and claims buried, the financial arrangements between his office and Kell and Pruitt. He gave them Ord's arrangement. He gave them Raymond Whitmore's role in the forging of William Whitmore's signature on the original property transfer. He gave them, in other words, the whole thing. Pruitt left Red Hollow that night. He simply went. No confrontation, no last-minute maneuvering, just an empty house in the morning where he'd been the evening before. He got further than Fosse had before Harmon's people caught up with him, but not as far as he'd planned. Kell, who didn't have the same instinct for the right moment to run, was still in Red Hollow when the federal warrants arrived, and he received them with the particular expression of a man who'd spent his entire adult life believing that his position protected him from consequences and was only now discovering the limit of that belief. The arrests happened over 3 days. Kell, the county recorder. Pitts Ord, 2 of Pruitt's men who'd been identified in witness statements as participants in the trafficking operation, and 3 others whose names had come out of Pitts's cooperation. Raymond Whitmore was arrested at the property he'd taken from Clara. Still there, apparently having convinced himself that the distance between him and Red Hollow was sufficient. Dane told her about Raymond's arrest on the 3rd morning, carefully, watching her face. She took it in and was quiet for a moment. "Did he say anything?" she asked. "Not to me," Dane said. "He's talking to Harmon's people. I expect he's cooperating. It's that kind of situation." She thought about Raymond at the kitchen table with his glass and his eyes that wouldn't meet hers. She thought about the careful years of his planning, the slow, patient construction of something that required her father's death and her own life to build. She tried to find something uncomplicated in her response to his arrest, relief or satisfaction or anger, and couldn't. What she found instead was the same thing she'd found sitting on Dottie's bed on the first day, the practical weight of what was true, stripped of the comfort of simple feeling. "All right," she said. Dane looked at her. "Are you—" "I'm fine," she said. Then, "I don't know what I am, but I'm not falling apart, if that's what you're asking." He nodded. He didn't push. She'd come to understand this about him, that he had a particular respect for people's right to experience things at their own pace, which probably came from the same place as his quietness, from having learned at some point that forcing things open before they were ready didn't help anyone. She looked at the main street of Red Hollow, at the ordinary morning activity resuming around the extraordinary wreckage of the past 2 weeks. Vera Aldis was walking toward the laundry, not rushing. May Sutter's wagon was at the general store. Gus Pettit was outside the freight office talking to one of Kell's former ranch hands, with the easy posture of a man who didn't need to be watching over his shoulder. "What happens to the land?" she asked. "The properties they took, legally." "Harmon says the fraudulent transfers get voided," Dane said. "The original owners or their heirs can file to restore title. It'll take time. These things always do. But the legal basis is clear." She considered this carefully. The Whitmore property. Her father's land, her grandfather's before that. The land that Raymond had stripped and sold, and that Kell's holding company had been sitting on for 3 years while the creek dried up and the eastern pasture went the color of straw. "Can I file?" she said. "You're the heir," Dane said. She nodded slowly. The practicalities of it began assembling themselves in her mind. What needed to be done, in what order, what the land would require after 3 years of neglect under owners who hadn't cared about it. It was a long list. It started with water and ended with fencing and had about 40 items in between, most of them requiring money she didn't have and labor she'd have to find. None of that made her not want it. She turned to look at Dane, who was watching her with the patient attention he'd developed somewhere over the past 3 weeks of building something together in Dottie's common room. "I'm going to need help," she said. It cost her something to say it. She was not a person who said that easily, but she said it. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to—" "I know you're not asking," he said. "I'm telling you I'll help." He paused. "If you want that." She looked at him for a long moment. In the amber light of the red hollow morning, with the dust and the dry heat and the imperfect, complicated reality of everything that had happened, she made the first purely voluntary decision she'd made since Raymond had sold her on a Tuesday in July. "Yes," she said, "I want that." The title restoration took 4 months. Claire had known it would take time. Dane had told her, Harmon had told her, even Dottie had mentioned it in the practical way she mentioned everything. But knowing something in the abstract and living through it were different experiences. 4 months of paperwork filed in triplicate, of waiting for responses from the territorial capital that arrived late or incomplete, of one deputy commissioner who lost a critical document and had to be contacted 3 separate times before he located it in the wrong file. 4 months of living at Dottie's boarding house on money she earned doing accounts for the general store, because it turned out that her years of watching her father manage the property books had given her a facility with numbers that Arlo Beck's brother, who ran the store, was grateful to pay for. She went to the Whitmore property twice during those months. Not to stay. There was no practical reason to be there yet, and a practical reason not to be since the holding company's former caretaker had left the place in a state that required assessment before it required presence. But she went, because it was hers, and she needed to know what she was waiting for. The first visit was in August, 6 weeks after the arrests. She rode out alone in the early morning, when the heat was still manageable, and stood in the yard where Raymond had told her to get her things, and looked at the house and felt the complicated mixture of things that places from your past produced in you when the past had been difficult, the love that was separate from the pain, the two existing simultaneously without resolving each other. The house was in worse shape than she'd expected. The caretaker had done the minimum, kept the roof from actively leaking, kept the well from collapsing. Everything else had been ignored. The porch boards had warped. The barn door had come off one hinge and been propped rather than repaired. The eastern pasture was exactly the color she remembered. Dead straw, not a blade of green. And the creek was still low, though not as low as it had been at the worst of the summer. She walked through every room. Her father's books were still on the shelf by the window. That surprised her. She'd expected them to be gone, sold or discarded. But there they were, dusty and undisturbed. 10 or 12 volumes on animal husbandry and land management, and one collection of maps that her father had never quite explained, and that she'd always suspected he'd acquired more for the pleasure of looking at them than for any practical purpose. She stood in front of that shelf for a long time. The second visit was in October, after the first frost, and she brought Dane. She showed him the property, the way you showed someone something that mattered to you. Not performing the showing, just walking and talking, explaining what had been where and what she planned and what she wasn't sure about yet. He was a good listener when it mattered. He asked the right questions and didn't fill silence with noise. "The creek needs clearing," he said, standing at the bank of it. The water was running cleaner now, the summer drought giving way to early autumn rains, but the bank on the western side had eroded and the channel had shifted in a way that wasn't ideal for the pasture drainage. "I know," she said. "2 people could do it in a week, maybe less." She looked at him sideways. "Are you offering?" He considered the question with the gravity he brought to most things. "I'm saying it's a manageable problem." "That's not the same as offering." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He looked at the creek for a moment. "I'm offering." She laughed. She hadn't been expecting to laugh, and it came out a little rough, a little surprised, which made it more genuine than a smooth laugh would have been. He looked at her when she laughed, and something in his face shifted in the way she'd noticed a handful of times over the months. Something warming in the eyes, brief and unperformed. "All right," she said. "I'll feed you while you work." "That seems fair," he said. The title transfer came through on a Tuesday in November, the same day of the week she noticed with the dark humor of someone who'd lived through enough to find patterns funny that Raymond had told her to get her things. She received the documents in the Territorial Land Office, signed where the clerk indicated, and walked out onto the street with a piece of paper that said the Whitmore property belonged to Clara Whitmore, free and clear. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment with the paper in her hand and waited for some feeling to arrive that was proportional to the significance of what had just happened. What she felt instead was tired and hungry and in need of coffee, which was probably more honest than anything dramatic would have been. She found Dane at the freight office, where he'd been helping Gus organize a shipment that needed to go out before the winter weather made the eastern road difficult. She held up the paper without saying anything. He looked at it. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. Gus, who knew the whole story and had lived a piece of it himself, looked at the document and then at Clara and then cleared his throat. "We should probably celebrate that," he said. "Probably," Clara said. "Dottie's making a beef stew tonight," Gus said. "I happen to know because she told me this morning." "That's not exactly a celebration," Dane said. "It's Dottie's stew," Gus said, with the gravity of someone stating a known fact. That's enough. It was enough. They ate at Dottie's that night. Clara, Dane, Gus, Vera Aldis, who'd heard about the title transfer and shown up with a pie she'd baked and declined to explain the origin of May Sutter, who came late and sat at the end of the table and ate 2 bowls of stew without conversation, but with the air of someone content to be present. Dottie sat with them for part of it, which she didn't always do, which was its own form of acknowledgement. It was not a dramatic evening. Nobody made speeches. The conversation moved through ordinary things. The weather, the Eastern Road, Arlo Beck's new arrangement with a cattle buyer from the territorial capital, whether the old mine above the valley was going to reopen under new ownership. But there was something underneath the ordinary conversation that Clara felt as a quality of the room itself, the particular ease of people who had been through something real together and come out the other side and were now sitting at a table eating stew, which was what people who had been through things real together eventually did, if they were lucky. She looked around the table and thought about the way the summer had started. The dried well, the strangers measuring fence lines, the particular flat dread of watching Raymond's plan become visible too late to stop it. She thought about the auction house and the platform and the way the room had looked from up there, the crowd's particular quality of willing complicity. She thought about Dane walking through those doors. The thing she'd learned over the months since was that the story she'd almost ended up in, Clara Whitmore, sold on a Tuesday in Red Hollow, was not an unusual story. That was the thing that stayed with her. Not the drama of her own situation, but the 40 families in Dane's records, the women before her who'd stood on Foss's platform and gone somewhere with someone who'd bought them, the Theodore Sears who'd ridden out to his land and not come back. The machine that had processed all of them had been running for 6 years in Red Hollow alone, and Red Hollow was not unique. This was not a comfortable thing to know. It was the kind of knowledge that changed what you did with your mornings. She moved back to the property in December when the repairs were sufficient to make it livable. Not fully restored, that would take years and more money than she currently had, but livable, which was the right starting point. The porch boards were replaced, the barn door was properly hung, the eastern pasture was still dead, but the creek bank had been cleared and the channel straightened, which would help in the spring when the snow melt came down from the ridge. Dane had helped with the work, as offered. He'd spent 3 weeks at the property in October and November, doing the physical labor that 2 people could do faster than one, eating the meals she cooked with the honest appetite of someone who'd been working hard, sleeping in the barn because that was what the situation called for, and neither of them made it complicated. It was not a smooth arrangement. They were 2 people who'd both spent most of their lives being primarily responsible for themselves, which meant that they had opinions about how things should be done, and the opinions didn't always match, and they'd had 4 or 5 conversations during those 3 weeks that weren't exactly arguments but were emphatic enough to qualify. The first was about the barn door, which she wanted hung a certain way based on how her father had always hung it, and which Dane thought was mechanically inferior to an alternative method he'd learned somewhere. "It's my barn door," she said. "I'm aware," he said. "I'm telling you the hinge placement you want is going to give you problems in 2 years. My father hung it that way for 15 years without problems." "Your father might have been wrong about barn doors," Dane said. "He was apparently right about most things, but barn doors are a specific thing." She looked at him. "You never met my father." "No," he said, "but I've hung a lot of doors." She thought about this for a moment. "Fine," she said. "Show me why." He showed her. She looked at it and conceded that the alternative hinge placement was probably better, which she did without gracelessness because she'd been raised to care more about correct information than about being right. "You could have just said you'd do it my way," she said afterward. "I could have," he said, "but you didn't. You don't want people to just do things your way," he said. "You want to know the right answer." She looked at him. "That's accurate," she said. "It's slightly irritating that you noticed it that fast." "It was pretty obvious from the auction house," he said. Commissioner Harmon's inquiry concluded in February, after a proceeding that lasted 11 days and produced a record several hundred pages long. The outcomes were specific and documented. Kell was convicted on 7 counts of land fraud and 2 of conspiracy, sentenced to 12 years in the territorial prison. The county recorder, Pitts, received 5 years in exchange for his cooperation, which Harmon's clerk noted in the official record as having been essential to the breadth of the conviction. Ord was removed from office and convicted on charges of corruption and accessory, sentenced to 3 years. 3 of Pruitt's men received varying sentences for their roles in the trafficking operation. Pruitt himself received 15 years. He was convicted on 14 counts in total: the land fraud, the trafficking operation, the conspiracy to intimidate witnesses that included May Sutter's fence. Harmon had been thorough. Harmon had been thorough in a way that Clara suspected had something to do with his personal response to the situation, to the scale of what had been operating in Red Hollow, to the weight of 40 families' worth of damage that had accumulated over 6 years. Raymond Whitmore cooperated fully and received 2 years, which was the minimum the convictions allowed for his involvement. Clara had submitted a written statement to Harmon's office regarding Raymond's role, which had been factual and precise and had contained no requests for leniency or severity. She'd written it in an evening, alone at her father's desk, and had not found it an easy thing to write or a satisfying thing to finish. She told Dane about it the next morning when he came to help with the fence line on the south side of the property. 2 years, he said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. How do you feel about that? She thought about it honestly. I don't know yet, she said. I think I'll know later. Right now I mostly feel like it's done. He nodded. He didn't press for more feeling than she had available, which she appreciated. What she did know, by February, was something that had clarified slowly over the months since August. Not a revelation, more like a gradual coming into focus. She knew that she was going to do something with what had happened, not in a grand declarative way, not with speeches or public gestures, but practically, specifically, in the way she did most things. She'd begun corresponding with Harmon's office about the other families in the records, 40 families whose land had been taken through the same mechanisms: the fraudulent transfers, the shell companies, the captured county recorder. Pitts's cooperation had produced the full picture of all of it, and Harmon's inquiry had created the legal basis for contesting each transfer individually. But contesting transfers required paperwork and filing and the navigation of a territorial legal system that most of the affected families didn't have experience with. Clara had experience with it now. She'd just done it herself. She wrote to 7 of the families in the first month. She explained what documents they needed, what the filing process looked like, where to submit and who to contact. She kept copies of everything and sent follow-up letters when she didn't hear back, because she knew that not hearing back usually meant someone was lost in the process, not that the process had worked. Vera Aldis's title restoration came through in March. She came to the property to tell Clara in person, riding out on a borrowed horse in weather that was still cold enough to make the trip unpleasant, because she wanted to say it directly. "It's done," Vera said. "I know," Clara said. "I got the notification copy last week." Vera looked at her. "I wanted to tell you anyway." Clara looked back at her. "All right." "What you did," Vera said, and then stopped. She was not a woman who overwrote things, which Clara had always respected about her. "What you did mattered." "You stood up in that room," Clara said. "That's what mattered." "You gave us a room to stand up in," Vera said. They looked at each other for a moment with the directness of two women who had each decided that simple statements of true things were more valuable than the decorative version. "Come inside," Clara said. "I have coffee." By spring, the eastern pasture was beginning to show color. It was not the transformation of a single season. Recovery didn't work that way, and Clara knew enough about land to know that the pasture that had died back in 3 years of neglect and drought would need 2 or 3 more to fully restore. But there was green coming up at the creek edge, spreading slowly inward, the grass asserting itself the way grass did when water was available, and the ground hadn't been entirely given up on. She stood at the fence line one morning in April and watched it. The new growth, the creek running clear, the ridge above the valley still wearing its winter white against the blue sky. Fletcher the mule was in the near pasture, still half blind, slower than he'd been, but still moving. She'd found him at the neighboring property where he'd been kept during the holding company's tenure and had brought him back immediately, which was not a practical decision, but was the right one. Dane came up beside her. He'd been repairing the gate on the north end of the property and had the particular absorbed look of a man who'd finished a task and was now ready to be somewhere else. "Grass is coming in," he said. "Slowly," she said. "Slowly is how grass comes in." She looked at him. In the April light, with the morning not quite warm yet, he looked like what he was. A man who'd been through things, who carried the weight of them in the way that certain people carried weight, not as a performance of hardship, but as a quality of how they moved through the world. The reputation that had preceded him into the auction house, dangerous, cold, a man defined by violence, was true in the narrow technical sense that he was capable of violence and had exercised that capability. But it was the kind of truth that was also a lie of omission, the kind that got applied to people who didn't fit the available categories, and so got filed under the closest frightening thing. She'd thought about this a lot over the winter, about what it meant that the person who'd walked into the worst moment of her life had been the one person in Red Hollow that everyone else was afraid of, about what that said about fear and usefulness and the gap between what people seemed to be and what they were. She didn't have a clean conclusion about it. She suspected there wasn't one. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "You," she said. She said it plainly, the way she said things that were true and didn't need managing. He looked at her. "In what regard?" "In the regard that you're still here," she said. "You didn't have a reason to stay. After the commissioner's inquiry, you could have gone anywhere." "I'm helping with the fence line," he said. "Dane." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the creek, then at the pasture, then at Fletcher standing in the near field with one eye closed against the morning light. "I don't have anywhere I'd rather be," he said. He said it with the same directness she used. Not romantic, not performed, just the statement of a true thing. She looked at him for a long moment, then she looked back at the pasture. "The south fence needs another 2 days," she said. "Probably 3, he said. "The post holes on the far end are in rocky ground." 3 then. They stood there for a while looking at the land. The morning warmed slowly around them, the way mornings did in April when winter was still arguing with spring, and neither had quite won. A hawk crossed the ridge above the valley, riding the thermal air without appearing to move its wings, covering ground with no visible effort. Clara thought about the girl who had stood on the auction platform in August. 18 years old, $15, her mother's sewing kit, the flat shock of having been sold by the last person she'd trusted. She wasn't sentimental about that girl. She didn't feel sorry for her or admire her particularly. What she felt was something closer to recognition, that the girl had been right to stay practical, right to keep her jaw tight and her eyes open, right to look at the room she was in and try to understand it rather than just survive it. The things that had gotten her through that morning were the things her father had built into her by accident and intention over 15 years. and the things her mother had left in her before she left entirely, and the things she'd learned in the 3 hard years of watching Raymond Whitmore make his decisions. None of it had been wasted. That was the thing she'd worked out, over the winter. The hard parts hadn't been preparation for a better story. They'd been part of the same story, the whole story, inseparable from what she'd been able to do when it mattered. She didn't think this made hardship good. She wasn't that kind of person. Vera Aldis's 3 years without her land weren't good. Theodore Sears, who'd ridden out to his field and not come back, wasn't good. The 40 families in Dane's records, the people before her on Fosse's platform, none of that was redeemed by what happened after. It was just what happened. The world was full of machines that ground people down, and some of the time the people who got ground down were able to stand up and do something about it, and some of the time they weren't, and the ones who weren't didn't deserve what happened to them. What you could do, what she'd understood by February, and what settled in her more completely every month, was pay attention, keep accounts, know what was happening around you and to the people near you, and stay in the position to say something about it when saying something was possible. This was not heroic in any conventional sense. It didn't make for a clean story, but it was what she had, and it was what she intended to use. The letters to the 40 families continued through spring, one by one, each one specific to that family's situation. 3 more title restorations came through by June. May Sutter's was one of them. She'd lost her son's claim, and when the restoration notice arrived, she came to the property again, same as she'd come in the evening of the first gathering at Dottie's, and sat at Clara's table and accepted a cup of coffee and said nothing for a while. "It's not the same as him having it," May said finally. She meant her son. She meant the 2 years between the theft of the claim and the restoration, the years her son had spent trying to build something elsewhere because his land was gone. "No," Clara said. "It's not." "But it's something," May said. "It's something," Clara agreed. That was the honest version. Not everything was fixed. Not everything could be. Raymond's 2 years would end, and he would come out the other side into a world that had moved on without him. And whatever accounting happened between him and Clara then was still unwritten. Ord was gone and a new marshal had been appointed. A younger man from the territorial capital named Beckett, who seemed to take the job at face value, which was all you could reasonably ask at the start. Fosse was somewhere in the territory, his whereabouts imprecise, which was a loose end that Clara kept in the back of her mind as a category of unfinished business. Red Hollow was not transformed. It was still a frontier town with dust and heat and the full range of human behavior that frontier towns contained. But the specific machine that had been running in it for 6 years was stopped. The county recorder's office had new staff and federal oversight until the next territorial election. The auction house building had been sold to a grain merchant from the eastern part of the valley who had no interest in its prior function and intended to use it for actual grain, which seemed appropriate. The 40 families were not yet 40 families with their land back. But they were 40 families with someone corresponding with them about the process, which was more than they'd had in August. It was spring in Red Hollow, and the creek was running, and the eastern pasture was coming back slow and green from its 3 dead years, and Clara Whitmore was standing at her fence line watching the morning come in. It was enough to work with. It was, she had decided, exactly enough.